Hello and welcome to the National Association of Scholars Great American Novel webinar series. I should say Great American Literature in this case, because the red badge of technical descriptions is a wonderful piece of work, however, and therefore this is why we wish to discuss it. Its place in American literature, what are its excellences, how does it work, what is its, how does it influence the tradition afterwards. I am delighted to welcome three eminent scholars whose works we will be putting into the chat below. So I won't be mentioning everything they've published, but Dr. Patrick Dooley is Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at St. Bonaventure University, and his writings include The Pluralistic Philosophy of Stephen Crane. Dr. Lee Clark Mitchell is Holmes Professor of Belles-Lettres at Princeton University, where he has served as chair of the English department and director of the program in American Studies. Among his many publications, Witnesses to a Vanishing America, the 19th Century Response. And then Dr. James Nagel is Edison Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of Georgia and a resident scholar at Dartmouth College. Many books also, including Stephen Crane and Literary Impressionism. So we are delighted and fortunate to have them to speak. I will just say briefly how we're doing things. 3 talks, 12 to 14 minutes in length, by the professors in alphabetical order by last name. Then question and answers, conversation sponsored by you, the audience, via me. And if the professors look, please type in your responses into the chat or Q&A buttons, where, by the way, I see questions about closed captioning. I don't believe we have closed captioning, to my knowledge. So you ask questions, I'll pass them on. The professors can look at them. If your questions don't get answered, please send email to me, randall@nas.org. I'll be glad to forward any questions that don't get answered to the professors afterwards. So never worry about your question not getting answered. And this will be recorded and available on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel, probably within 24 hours. Having said all that, may I please ask, Professor Dooley, would you be so kind as to begin?
I would. I'd be happy to begin. It's nice to be on this panel with 2 people. Can you see this?
Yes. Yes, we can.
That's my introduction to Crane was at this conference sponsored by University of Virginia Tech, Paul Sorrentino, in September of 1989. So it's 33 years we've been at this. Okay. I quit teaching before this era of webinars, so this is my first attempt at this. What I want to do is make a brief statement and then talk about Red Badge of Courage and its differences between it and War Memories, which Paul Sorrentino calls one of America's greatest accounts of war, and Michael Robertson regards as Crane's other masterpiece. So here's my statement, and then I'll expand on it in terms of Red Badge and then War Memories. Though it may seem odd to speak of Crane's evolution over a 6-year period, given the pace and intensity of his life, it's not. Indeed, his ability to absorb, process, and articulate his own experiences is yet another of his remarkable gifts. He began the Red Badge of Courage at the age of 21 in 1893, and only 6 years later, a year before he died, he wrote another of his masterpieces about combat, War Memories, in which he dramatized and reflected upon his firsthand experiences in battle, both as a correspondent and, interestingly, as a de facto military aide to Captain George F. Elliott. Among other things, Crane delivered commands from his company to the headquarters. My interest is in contrasting the fruits of his imagination in Red Badge with his capacity to explicate his own experience in war memories. Predictably, in both cases, he grapples with the nature of heroism, among other things. But more broadly, I am keen to explore how his evolved, which has to be in quotes with Crane, only a 6-year period, how his view of how human beings can understand and convey in language just how, as he puts it in his own narrative, the overwhelming, crushing monstrosity of armed conflict. In a word, borrowing William James's terminology from the Red Badge, from the Principle of Psychology, while Crane gives us knowledge about war in his first work, in his second, War Memories, he gives readers an enriched and funded knowledge by acquaintance. So James's contrast is between a theoretical knowledge about and an experiential knowledge by acquaintance. James's example is the difference between a blind man's understanding of color theory and sighted people's experience with color, which reminds me of a discussion in the faculty lounge several years ago. We were discussing which TV was best, and one of our colleagues was blind, but a devotee of Consumer Reports, and he wanted to wade in with his opinion about which TV was best, which we had trouble coming to grips with because he's blind. Though, as Thomas Beer famously put it, let it be stated that the mistress of this boy's mind was fear might be an overstatement. There's little doubt that Crane had a lifelong obsession with courage, bravery, and heroism. So I turn to those fixations now in the Red Badge of Courage. So what I want to do is compare Crane's knowledge about courage in Red Badge, and then later his knowledge by acquaintance in War Memories. In chapters 1 and 2, Henry Fleming tries to mathematically prove that he will not run. He doesn't think about being a hero or being brave, but that he won't be a coward. In chapter 3, he realizes, as Crane puts it, he's about to be measured. But then Fleming thinks he instantly saw it would be impossible for him to escape from the regiment. It enclosed him. There were laws of tradition and laws on 4 sides. He was in a moving box. So he has nothing more to do than go along with his comrades, and it's kind of a biochemical reflex mob sort of action. So Crane in the early chapters of Red Badge describes bravery as a biochemical reflex muscular kind of group courage. Nothing particularly moral or any initiative about it. Crane says in one of these dashes, he suddenly lost concern for himself. He became not a man, but a member. He was welded into a common personality, which was dominated by a single desire. For some moments he could not flee. No more than a little finger can commit revolution from a hand. He felt the subtle battle brotherhood. It was a mysterious fraternity born of smoke and danger and death. So in the first third of Red Badge of Courage, at several places, Fleming, along with his group, either move forward or they retreat and run. It's a group effort, motivated by just being with the group. Finally, in the last 2 chapters of the book, when he has his full Red Badge of Courage, having been hit on the head, retreating, he manages several more attempts at courage, but these also are reflex muscular kinds of courage. In chapter 19, he's again moving forward, but he's in another iron box. Crane says he was unconsciously in advance, and in a frenzy, he made a furious rush impelled by a mad enthusiasm, and the group charges. Then in chapter 23, when the regiment flag, he again mounts a charge, but this is another example of frenzy and madness and recklessness. So the Red Badge of Courage describes courage as a reflex, something that just happens to you. That's not the case at all with War Memories. So I'm doing my time. I guess I'm doing okay. So I'm going to look at Red Badge of Courage as an example of, War Memories as an example of Crane's funded experience, having been in the battle in a certain way, participating even as a correspondent. While the Red Badge concentrates on young, untried recruits, War Memories, Crane describes the calm and steady efforts and steely resolve of older rank and file soldiers. He gives his readers this, quote, pictures of men at work, men terribly hard at work, red-faced, sweating, grasping toilers. And though he admits himself was very terrified, he saw around him many men who did not seem to be afraid at all. Men with quiet, composed faces who went about this business as if they proceeded from a sense of habit. Many of them betrayed all the emotions and really the emotions that one sees in the face of a man earnestly at work. So it's a much different, calmer, quiet kind of place. Their matter-of-fact demeanor is especially obvious among the wounded and the dying, those who had actually had a red badge of courage. Well, they got me, he said in greeting. Usually they said that. There was no long speeches. Well, they got me. That was sufficient. Stunned by this conscious indifference of the wounded, Crane and his fellow journalists realized, and this is really a poignant account, the duty of the upright and unhurt men is then difficult. I doubt if many of us learned how to speak to our own wounded. In the first place, one had to play that the wound was nothing. As a result, I think most of us bungled and stammered in the presence of our wounded friends. Then too, instead of the battlefield noise and confusion, panicky retreat of the wounded and deserters in Red Badge, War Memories away from the front, he describes as a trail of silence, mute agony, people walking, no one complaining, no one moaning. Despite all the attention that Crane gives to the matter-of-fact duty and competence and silence of soldiers, perhaps the most compelling episode in War Memories is the account he gives the night he spent lying on the grass near young Assistant Surgeon Gibbs. In other words, what I'm saying is you could take all sorts of depictions of wounds or panic or courage and compare in the two books. This is very different than what Crane says in Red Badge about dying. Crane reports, I heard someone dying near me. He was dying hard. It took him a long time to die. The night was impenetrable. The man was lying in some depression with 7 feet away from me. I wanted him to die. Ultimately, he died. So in conclusion, following William James's categories of knowledge about and knowledge by acquaintance, I have assumed that knowledge by acquaintance is our primary and more reliable access to get the real thing, as Crane puts it in the opening sentence of War Memories. But Crane's war correspondent Vernal adds then, it seems impossible. It is because war is never magnificent or squalid, but simply life, an expression of life, and an expression of life can always evade us. So my argument is that War Memories is a poignant, vivid, arresting, revealing, and thought-provoking piece, much more subtle and revealing than Red Badge. Well, I find that his narrative makes great strides in his attempt to, as he puts it, get the real thing. With the stroke of his signature irony, Crane ends his story with his own self-assessment, pulling out the rug from underneath. The episode is closed. You can all depend on it. I've told you nothing. I've told you nothing. Nothing at all. Nothing at all. Okay.
Thank you so much. That was lovely to hear. And I'd like now to ask Professor Mitchell, would you be so kind to speak next?
Yeah. Let me start with a question that you addressed to me, which was when you asked me to participate in this. And it was an interesting one. The question was, despite his youth and lack of personal experience with warfare at the time of his writing, Crane wrote remarkably realistic depictions of battles. And to what do you attribute this? And it's impossible to tell where brilliance, genius comes from. And in fact, in Crane, as Professor Dooley has said, he started out at the age of 21 writing this, so he hadn't had much experience, and it was in the 1890s, and there had been no wars since 1865, so well beyond his time. And he basically began by looking at, he wanted to make a pot boiler, as it turned out. And so he turned to first-person accounts in the Century magazine, a very popular magazine at the time. And it had a popular series called Battles and Leaders of the Civil War. And he read it for a while. He did his research. He went to the library. And yet he was surprised at the kind of lifelessness of it all, the chronicling of facts and numbers and names. As he said himself, I wonder what some of these fellows don't tell how they felt in those scraps. They spout eternally what they did, but they were as emotionless as rocks. So he had started with a pot boiler, and yet he got in, as he said, I got interested in the thing in spite of myself, and I couldn't. I had to do it in my own way. And his own way was invariably, for whatever reason, was invariably to take a kind of contrary position. And he had been a journalist working in inner cities. He had written a novel called Maggie. That was itself unusual, but his style was always sui generis. It was always his own. And he just started by taking things apart. His own notion, I think, not only in war or about war, but in all of his other fictions, is that experience itself is fragmented, it's incoherent, it's unpredictable, before we tend to give it a certain abstract, a certain tentative, a certain linguistic coherence. And he ended up, and the style is clear to all of you who have read The Red Badge, I assume, in which his style doesn't seem at all like anything that had gone before. There are relatively few complex sentences or dependent clauses. What he gives us is a series of discrete images. And just for a second, let me just read just from chapter 4 of The Red Badge. The din in front swelled to a chorus. The youth and his followers were frozen to silence. They could see a flag that tossed in the smoke angrily. Near it were the blurred and agitated forms of troops. There came a turbulent stream of men across the field. The battery changed in position. A frantic gallop scattered the stragglers right and left. A shell screaming like a storm banshee went over the huddled heads of the reserves. It landed in the grove, and exploding redly flung the brown earth. There was a little shower of pine leaves. It's a wonderful construction there. Basically, when you stop to pause and to hear him, to listen, that series of passive constructions were frozen to silence, that tossed, went over, it landed. It doesn't give any sense of agency here, agency. And as well, we have a kind of confusion of syntax, the gerunds throughout, those ing words that clash with the participles, the past participles, those ed words, and then the whole jumps into the future and into the past at the same time. You toss in a curious simile, like a storm banshee, whatever that is. You offer an odd adverb, exploding redly. And in a few sentences, just a few, and exemplary, or exemplary, not unusual. And in a few sentences, we feel almost as if Crane were rewriting English, as if he were wrenching sense out of sentences. We might even consider the kind of illogical transitions between his sentences. I want to read one more time, I think, right out of him. This sentence, when he gets his red badge. It's in chapter 12, right in the middle of this deeply divided novel. The youth's fingers had turned to paste upon the other's arms. The energy was smitten from his muscles. He saw the flaming wings of lightning flash before his vision. There was a deafening rumble of thunder within his head, and suddenly his legs seemed to die. He sank writhing to the ground. He tried to rise. All of these simple sentences, each fragmented, cut off from the other. In his efforts against this numbing pain, he was like a man wrestling with a creature of the air there was a sinister struggle. Sometimes he would achieve a position half erect, battle with the air for a moment, and then fall again, grabbing at the grass. His face was of a clammy pallor. Deep groans were wrenched from him. This kind of shift from his fingers to his muscles, to the vision, to the rumble of sound, this sense of disorientation and violence. Never before in American literature had we seen anything be described this way. The groans wrenched from him as a kind of figure to whom things happen. All of this makes Crane's prose difficult to assess. It's almost too big. It's too resistant to generalization. It's hard to summarize. This style, right from the first, Joseph Conrad had recognized in Crane a temperament, quote, that makes all things new and new things amazing. And it's that radical freshness that readers, I think, find so engaging and yet so disorienting. We get, for the first time in American literature, first time in any literature, we get a narrative that refused to shift the narrative focus away from its central situation. It's the first novel devoted to the experience of war entirely. It fails to register, to divert attention away from this domestic subplots and comic relief that had so often been true of others. War and Peace, for example. Others, or the Iliad, in fact, go all the way back. All other authors had depicted the Civil War, like DeForest and Joseph Kirkland and Ambrose Bierce, but no one before had presented its effects in so intensely sustained a fashion. That sense of, for him, what Conrad also claimed about Crane was that he was an impressionist. His staccato style, constantly breaking with expectations. I think the one thing you can say about Crane's entire career is that he breaks from expectations. He wants to do something that's going to be different. It's this war story that's finally an anti-war story. In The Open Boat, he writes an anti-sea story. In The Blue Hotel and Bride of Comes to Yellow Sky, he writes anti-westerns. And he writes an anti-race novella in The Monster. It's as if he simply does not want to deal with our conventional expectations for the ways in which things happen. That's, I think, the most striking thing to mention about him. And in fact, it's one of the hard things is we want to try to place him and place this novel. And the novel is certainly, it was popular right from the get-go. It was famously a success, popular success, and a critical success. It's been highly influential thereafter. Hemingway talked about it as one of the three major figures who influenced him. Sherwood Anderson, I think, to a certain extent as well, was influenced by him. Was Crane himself influenced by people before? Well, someone once said it seemed a little bit like Mallarmé, and he said, "Oh, I don't read those Irish authors." This kind of, this kind of whimsical resistance to having been influenced by anyone, which is common to American authors at that sense. But what critics constantly noticed was that his prose was so staccato, it's so vivid, it's so based upon images. It's as if we want to make sense out of it, and we can't find a way to do that. The interesting question then to raise about this novel, and I suppose I'll draw to a slight conclusion here in the next few minutes, is that the question we keep raising ever since we've all read it in high school, I think, perhaps that's a mistake, I think, is, and this is one of the questions that that was addressed to the three of us speakers, was how does Crane depict the themes of cowardice and heroism? And in fact, Crane was slammed for the fact that he didn't make Henry enough of a hero. General McClure, one of the famous generals from the Civil War, just just wanted to dismiss him, wanted to hang him, as it were. But the real question then, and for all of us who have taught this book, is how do we figure out whether Henry becomes a man at the end or not. The difficulty with this, and I'm not only going to touch on this, is that there are three versions of the Red Badge of Courage. And so when we talk about this novel, it's very hard to know. It was published first as a newspaper event, basically 1/3 the length of his original manuscript. And it did pretty well, and it set the scene for a lot of readers who were interested to see what the whole thing would look like. It was then given over to Appleton Publishers, and they had an editor who went through the whole, a guy named Ripley Hitchcock, and he cut the whole thing tremendously. And I think it's basically cut by something, thousands of words, and changed the ending and so on. And that is what's been published. And that's what we've dealt with for something like 70 odd years, until finally scholars got together and decided they wanted to see what Crane's initial intention had been. The problem for first, as all three of us can attest, for any author who tries to get published, is you've got no power. And so basically publishers tell you what they want and whether they'll accept it and what you should cut and what you should change. And if you've never published anything before, you're likely to do what they say. This is the situation that Crane was in, Theodore Dreiser was in, Thomas Wolfe was in, many American authors have been, Frank Norris was in, all of them had this situation, and then changed altered their novels when they began there, especially their opening novels. Crane changed his from what his initial manuscript had been. The one claim to make for keeping that published version is that Crane never, even in the next 5 years of his very short life, never made an attempt to republish the manuscript as it had been when he became famous. What's to be said on the other side, and there's a big critical argument about this, is that the manuscript version, which finally came out in the 1970s, gives a very different version of, a very different narrative perspective on Henry Fleming. And the three of us have all spent many hours in classrooms talking about these questions with students and trying to figure out how to generalize about this situation that we get in the novel, which is so disparate, so imagistically powerful. How do we make sense out of this? How do we get some clear reading of it? It's very hard to figure that out. Crane so focuses on details that we never know that this is a civil war. We assume it, blue uniforms and gray. We know it's Chancellorsville by one of the most famous and Pyrrhic victories for the South in the Civil War, and yet no names are given. In fact, Crane, when he went through, doesn't even give names to the characters. He takes it out of the narrative. They only appear as names Henry in the dialogue between them. And in some ways that makes things not more, but it makes things more immediate. It wasn't called the Battle of Chancellorsville, after all, until the whole was over, when you could give it a name, a meaning, an interpretation, but only as a way of registering that we're no longer in that moment. We're filing it away. Avoiding the names makes us concentrate on the feelings, not the facts, on the sense experiences, not their meaning in terms of dates and battles. The question of how it feels to be in war, where little makes any sense. Ground is gained, ground is given up. Death occurs independent of actions. In fact, the whole thing is told from the perspective of the young soldier. I think the first rule in reading Crane, and perhaps the last rule, the only rule with which I'll leave you, is to resist any generalizations that are easy, to approach his fiction almost like poetry, and to begin always, before you draw conclusions, with the formal aspects of each of these chapters. with that, I think I'll end and wait for the questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And lovely to hear that also. And may I also now ask Professor Nagel, would you be so kind?
I'll be glad to. I'm humbled a bit to follow Professors Mitchell and Dooley, but I'll try to make some comments. Before I get to what I planned on saying, Lee's comments on Impressionism lead me to offer a couple of observations. Of course, I did a book on Stephen Crane and Impressionism. The distinction between Impressionism and realism is essentially that in realism, the assumption is that reality is stable. It can be analyzed and represented in art. In Impressionism, the assumption is that reality is fragmentary, momentary, and you experience it only in little blips of sensory experience. There's no cohesion to experience that forms into an overall meaning of life. Crane, of course, lived in the Art Students League for 2 years, and his friends and roommates in the Art Students League all studied Impressionism from the faculty at the school, all of whom had studied Impressionism in Paris with the Impressionist painters. In the evenings, the students would sit around and look at the paintings on the wall and talk about the philosophy of Impressionism. And Crane was there, and part of that, and the thesis of my book is that that's the way he represents reality in his fiction. And I won't say more than that, but remember that what Crane gives us in the Red Badge are fragments of experience in a 3-day period in the middle of a battle. The battle has already begun before the novel starts. The battle is ongoing when the novel ends. So it's not about the battle. The battle is essentially inside Henry Fleming in his battle against himself, his fear, his sense of guilt, and so on. I think the novel is significant in a couple of senses. One is its social significance. This is often taken to be the best American novel of the Civil War. And the Civil War is, to my sense, the most important event that has happened in our country ever. But it's a novel, it's a war novel without any political disputation. There's no argument for one side or the other. You don't know why Henry Fleming is there. His being there doesn't make any difference to the overall outcome of the issues. Whether he lives or dies is essentially insignificant to the overall war effort. He is an ordinary soldier caught up in battle, and that is fundamentally the nature of the American war novel. The fact that he deserts links Red Badge with the best of the American war novels that follow. For example, Farewell to Arms, Frederick Henry ultimately deserts and runs away from Italy to Switzerland. Catch-22 is essentially Sarian's novel about how much he hates the war machine, and he deserts at the end to go to Sweden. Going After Cacciato is about a man on duty at night in a watchtower, but what he fantasizes about is deserting and going after Cacciato, who would be a deserter. All of these are fundamentally anti-war novels, and I think that is the great American tradition of writing about war. It's the individual who matters, not the great international or national disputes. European war novels tend to focus on aristocrats who become generals in the war, and they're moving pieces about on the map, and all of this is of grand significance. What happens to the protagonist is fundamental to what will happen to the whole of that country. American heroes tend to be ordinary, common characters, very much like Henry Fleming, who's the youngest of all of these protagonists, but he's middle class at best, maybe even lower class. He's a common private. He has no control over anyone else. And fundamentally, he does not understand the war. He never thinks about what they're fighting for or how he hopes it will come out. So it's not, the novel is about his thoughts and feelings. It's not even about the action of war. The action is inconclusive at the end. If indeed it is about Chancellorsville, as Crane said after he had written The Red Badge of Courage, the South won that battle. So it would hardly be about the great Union cause and how Henry Fleming's actions helped to win it. The fact that all of these soldiers are young means that they're all fundamentally Bildungsroman. They're the story of how someone internalizes experience and matures and grows and comes to make an adult decision about things. The best case that can be made that Henry grows and matures is in the imagery of the novel. I'll say more about this in a moment, but the early imagery of Henry Fleming is that of a babe. As a matter of fact, in chapters 1 through 6, he's over and over again referred to in baby imagery. In the last 6 chapters, particularly after chapter 18, in which he experiences an epiphany, he's described in imagery of being a man. And I think that for people who are sensitive to the interpretive implications of imagery, it says something about his internal growth. The other sense in which I think the Red Badge is significant is artistically. And I want to talk briefly about 3 things, about the structure of it, the imagery of it, and the overall theme. Crane seems to be very careful about structure. Red Badge of Courage is 24 chapters. The first 6 are 1 unit, the second 6, a second unit. Second 6 end, of course, in chapter 12, which is where Henry Fleming rejoins his regiment. Chapter 6 in the middle of it is where he deserts and runs. Chapter 18 in the middle of the second half is where he experiences an epiphany and fundamentally changes as a person. And then, of course, chapter 24 is the end. The imagery changes throughout in the manner that I described, and it underscores his psychological growth, his growth of understanding of himself as he moves through this experience. The concept of Henry making a separate piece in chapter 6 is hardly heroic, but it is fairly typical of what happens to all of the American war novels. And I think maybe I could say something a little more in detail about each of those sections. In chapters 1 through 6, Henry is struggling with himself, with his fear, with his illusions about things. At first, he thinks of himself in Homeric terms as coming home on a shield, for example. And then that shifts to the other end of the spectrum, and he's worried that he might run and reveal himself to be a coward. And of course, that is what finally happens. The battle is with Henry's fear. And it's the monsters that he thinks about are, of course, projections of his fear. You'd have to be stupid to go out as a boy and fight against monsters and dragons and huge reptiles and a blood-swollen god. This is the way Henry thinks of the enemy, and that justifies his running in battle. As it turns out, of course, Henry's quite wrong. His regiment holds the line, and he is humiliated in chapters 7 through 12 to be wandering around behind the lines with men who are wounded. So that changes the thematic center of the second section of the novel to that of guilt, attempts at self-justification, and his overwhelming sense of shame. In the third section of the novel, at the end of chapter 12, he accidentally rejoins his regiment. Now he has to find some method of reconciliation with his regiment and feeling that he is a part of it. He's fortunate that he got banged in the head in chapter 12, and he has a small wound in his head that the other soldiers accept as a graze from a bullet. And he uses that. He's living a lie, of course, all the rest of the novel, but it is acceptable. In chapter 18, what happens to him is a quintessentially impressionistic epiphany. He is allowed to see more clearly than ever before. He sees everything. Each blade of grass was bold and clear. He sees himself realistically, not as a Homeric hero or even as a coward, but as an ordinary soldier, one with his fellows, no different than they are. And all he has to do is do his duty as the rest of these young boys are doing. And that realization leads to assertions by the narrator that his soul had changed and he had become a man. He had rid himself of the red sickness of battle. He has at last found at least some kind of temporary inner peace. And he has done that by becoming a more humble soldier, realizing that he's insignificant. The enemy is no more out to get him than it is to get anyone else. And because of the impressionistic nature of the narration, the reader participates in the sensory experiences that he goes through. There's no summation. He doesn't come to a broad understanding of the whole meaning of the battle or of the war or of the Union cause. The only way you know he fights for the Union is that twice his fellow soldiers are described as being in blue uniforms. And on one occasion, the enemy is described as being gray. But other than that, he realizes that they are just the same sort of simple fellers that he is. And they exchange comments along those lines. Now, I see that we're running out of time, so I think I will, I'll stop and we'll deal with questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. And I'm going to encourage everybody who is watching, please put more questions in. Well, most of them are coming into the chat now, but chat or questions and answers. So I'm going to start with a question, which I will push a little bit, from Richard Morgan, who is asking, well, about Henry Fleming, purposelessness and angst-ridden youth trying to experience the patriotic and grand purpose of war. Is his character a reflection of late 19th century Nietzsche or Kierkegaard in its woeful recognition of the metaphysic emptiness of war? Was this disconnect a precursor of All Quiet on the Western Front? I want to push that a little by pushing it towards American philosophy. Is it a parallel or a reflection of American pragmatic philosophy of the 1890s? Does it express a similar spirit? Is it useful, actually, I would even add, to talk about philosophical parallels if, for example, he'd never read William James?
Patrick, that would seem to me to be your territory.
Yeah, instead of saying that Crane's constructed a fragmentary impressionistic world, I think he reflects William James's view that the world is a pluriverse. All sorts of realities are constructed by various kinds of thinkers. And the way you appraise and work through these various realities is pragmatically. Which ones work, which ones fail, which ones are helpful, which ones are not helpful. So I think Crane is imbued with that culture, the pragmatic culture that was part of the 19th century mindset. I don't think he read James. I'm pretty sure he didn't, but I think James is a useful tool to explain what Crane has said underneath his prose.
Do either of you, the other professors, wish to add to that?
I'm not sure that from an impressionistic point of view, experience coalesces into those various pragmatic structures. I think the difficulty is in making any sense out of experience at all. Reality is forever changing. Remember, the Impressionists would go out and paint for 15 minutes and then they'd have to stop doing that painting because reality had changed. The sunlight was different now than it was 15 minutes ago. And reality consisted of very short fragments of experience that do not coalesce into broad patterns of meaning. And that was fundamental to the idea of Impressionism. And I think that Crane's Red Badge of Courage fits into that. Henry Fleming never comes, nor does the narrator, come to any overall understanding the war, what it's about, and what all of this means.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I don't think, from Crane's point of view or his contemporaries, there was a reality with the capital R, one edition of it. There are realities. And since there are several realities, there are several ways you can negotiate them. And the pragmatic take on that is that you appraise the various approaches in terms of whether they work or not. So I don't think we're disagreeing, actually.
I'd like to seize on the word experience. So I gather that Stephen Crane was the son of a Methodist minister. Is this in any sense a Methodist novel, the great Methodist novel, coming out of a religious tradition emphasizing experience, or even more broadly, the entire, Puritan, post-Puritan tradition and emphasis on experiential religion?
Well, it's true that his father was a Methodist minister, but his father died when he was only 8. And his mother, of course, was deeply Methodist. Her father was a Methodist minister, and she wrote for Methodist magazine, but she died when he was only 14. I think Crane is, in his life, anti-religious. Look at his poetry, for example. It hardly endorses Christianity in general. And it certainly doesn't differentiate Methodism from any other approach to it. Crane is pretty cynical about religious meanings and the whole concept of a benevolent deity that's watching over us, I think in Crane would be a highly ironic point of view.
Yeah, or that God has an overview that pulls everything into one view. I think he would disagree with that as well. I think, as I said in one of my articles, the religion that was poured into him came out sideways as swearing. That's the part of religion he liked a lot, profanity.
Yeah. Professor Mitchell, did you want to add anything to this? Or?
No, only to say that, since my presentation was largely about Crane's, breaking apart from interpretations, he was a terrible student. number one. So he's unlikely to have read or even pronounced the name Kierkegaard or Nietzsche in his entire life. He was also, I mean, so I don't think he, and you know, as Professor Nagel says, his Methodist father died when he was only 8. So I don't think, you know, he went on to Syracuse. He was more important at playing baseball than he was, you know, at anything else, and may have picked up, you know, a fair amount. But it was what he learned in the streets, what he learned in terms of his writing, and he wrote even as an undergraduate. He was already starting Maggie, and had, you know, so he was committed to writing. You know, what you get over and over in his stories, especially where it's made clearer and they're written after the Rebecca Courage, is they all end with a denial that interpretation is going to work. They thought that they could then be interpreters, is what's stated at the very close of The Open Boat. And I think that's his final story. That sense, or the kinds of interpretations that go on in the Blue Hotel, where they all give kind of wildly varying interpretations of things that the reader already absorbs in a quite different fashion. I'm not even prepared to accept, you know, as much as I admire Jim Nagel's work, I'm not prepared to accept that there has been this transformation in Henry, who I see as, compared to Wilson, is, you know, still, if you compare the moment in the text where he runs away from combat in chapter 6, I think it is, and then the moment when he charges in chapter 19, they are described in exactly the same language. It's exactly the same loss of self-possession, the same kind of mad Jim Hickey quality that he's got. And what happens after that then is somebody who I would say could be read in different ways. Mine happens to be that he's as arrogant and as egotistical as he and as vainglorious as he was to begin with. I can understand, however, that for me to make my case against interpretation convincing, I can't place too much on my interpretation. It would be in denial of the very claim I want to make. That is to say that Crane's vividness is what prompts such contradictory kinds of interpretations, and that's what's brilliant about the novel. That's what makes it a great American novel. That's what makes it so inspiring for those who came after.
I'm inspired to say a brief word about Chancellorsville. This came up earlier. It should be said that in prep school, Crane had a history teacher who had fought at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Now, I don't want to make too much of that. I'm not, when he was in prep school, Crane was not thinking about writing a novel about anything, probably. And but there'd be no shortage of information about war experiences in the Civil War. Virtually every senior officer published his memoirs of it. The Brady photographs filled the magazines. The Civil War was a very big event, and people wrote about it for decades after it had ended. And Crane would have picked up a lot of information about it. But it doesn't matter what battle it is, because the battle isn't even over when the novel ends. The focus is on his immediate sensory experiences in the middle of things, the psychological battle that's going on inside of Henry Fleming.
I have a very specific question I'd like to ask. Yeah, did he inspire anybody to write, you know, the great Southern Confederate war novel?
Not that I know.
Is there one, by the way?
The best account of the Civil War from a Southern point of view is Shelby Foote. But that's not a novel. That's a strong historical narrative that presents the Southern point of view in very convincing terms. Jim McPherson is the one who's written the Northern point of view, also very popular. So those are the two go-to places if you tend to be more interested in the history of the battles.
Some,
I just want
somebody
to say
in the comments is saying Faulkner is Absalom.
Well, but even in Faulkner, you tend to get the domestic view of war, the people back home in society, not the soldier out on the front line, ducking from shells that are going through the trees and so forth. Southern writers tended not to write about the Civil War. Cable wrote some stuff. He was in the cavalry, of course, but had a short career because he was wounded in that and never went back and rejoined his unit. Maybe the best representation of the Southern attitude about the war was written by a Northern woman, Constance Fenimore Wolfson. She tended to go to other sections of the country. I think she was from Michigan, but she moved to other sections of the country and wrote intensely about that point of view. And she lived much of the rest of her life in the South and wrote very compellingly about it. But there's nothing to compare to the Red Badge of Courage in Southern literature that I'm aware of. And I taught at Georgia for 2 decades.
I just wanted to make a small point. Shelby Foote has a short essay on Red Badge, and he ends it by saying, I think Lee said this earlier, that all great war novels are in the end anti-war. And he underscored the same point with Red Badge.
I'm going to go to a different question from the audience, from Tom Zellman. How would you situate Crane's later collection of Spanish-American war tales, Wounds in the Rain, in regards to Red Badge? So, I mean, I think there was already a comment about one particular story from there, but just in general, you know, does it build on it? Does it do stuff better? Does it shift the focus?
I had the students in one of my graduate seminars think about that question. What we did was to read Crane's war fiction that he wrote prior to ever actually observing war. And then we read the stories he had written after he had actually seen war in Cuba. And what we agreed upon is that the ones he wrote before he went to Cuba are much more intense and realistic and detailed than the ones he wrote later. In other words, his war fiction did not improve because he had actually observed it.
Professor Dooley, Professor Mitchell?
I'd say, following the remarks I made earlier, that when he experienced war as a journalist and then as a participant, maybe there's less intensity to his war fiction, but there's a depth and detail about it and empathy with the people who are in it and suffering that's not clear in his earlier stuff. So I think he says in Valestino, Crane at Valestino, he has this gorgeous description how glorious war is. And then he says, but then there's the point of view of the Turks who are suffering and dying there. So I think his experience of war chastened him and softened him, and he's less sure of himself and less arrogant. So that's the way I'd put it, and more modest about whether he can understand what's going on at all.
Professor Mitchell?
No, I don't have very much to add. What makes it also contradictory is that Crane seems to have a very dubious view of the notion of heroism, or in one regard, and yet people who saw him acting, you know, in the battlements in the Spanish-American War, he'd also gone to the Greco-Turkish War as well before, remarked on how absolutely heroic and and defiant he was in the battle. And so there was this kind of strange amalgam for him of at one and the same time, representing these heroic virtues and yet having a deep dubiety about what they might mean in a certain way.
I think,
He's he's basically only in his mid-20s when he has this kind of this ability to capture in prose experience that really is extreme. And in my own reading of his best writing, and there's some of the later stuff that was done, churned out, as it were, to make money. But his best stuff is as a kind of defiant of the kinds of generalizing expectations that we place upon this day-to-day life, this daily war life, extreme life, extreme experience.
I think one point I want to add to all of this is an emphasis on Crane's almost incredible imaginative faculty. He often wrote best about things before he really knew much about them. For example, he knew almost nothing about New York when he wrote Maggie. Then he moved to New York and personally experienced the Bowery and wrote the Bowery Tales and so forth. And out comes George's Mother, which takes place in the same building as Maggie, and Maggie actually appears in it very briefly. But George's Mother is nowhere near as good a novel as Maggie. And that was written after he had personally experienced the Bowery. Crane had incredible imagination. Imagine a kid who starts writing short stories that are important when he's 14 years old.
I would agree entirely with what Jim just said, but on the other side, his best short story, I think by common acclaim, is The Open Boat, which was based upon his own experience, was written up first as a newspaper report, and then he writes it up as a story, that seems to turn, we just made a judgment that he once again turns on its head. So I agree, and yet I find this other kind of experience so confounding.
Yeah, I agree. Between the several versions of Red Badge, Crane kept revisiting heroism and wrote 6 or 7 accounts and tales that talked about heroism. The Mystery of Heroism was right after the syndicated version, and he says about this Fred Collins who wants to fill canteens and he dares to run through a no man's meadow, and he says this about Fred: he had blindly been led by quaint emotions. He was mainly surprised. As he runs on, he's dazed and disappointed as he says to himself, if this is heroism, then either heroes are not much, or he was an intruder into the land of fine deeds. Crane has incredible descriptions of heroism. And I think the other thing to be added into here is his everyday heroes show up in all sorts of writings all along his corpus. So it's ordinary people doing ordinary jobs, not being thanked, not being noticed, that he is attentive to, not splashy heroes.
I'm going to go to a question. Well, does Pam Walter, does anyone know if Red Badge of Courage is still being used in high school classes? And I'm going to add to that, what do you think is actually the best age to read this for the first time? Is it appropriate for high school? Would it be better in college later? Do you have thoughts on that as a sort of expansion of her question?
My experience was that the Red Badge was read in high school, but misread in high school. Students read it as a kind of traditional war novel in which the protagonist becomes a great hero and is much celebrated and so forth. We totally missed the anti-war subtext of the whole novel. Now, when I read it again in a class in college, we got into those kinds of ideas. So I'm all for people reading it in high school, but it all depends what approach you take.
My experience is, I teach it regularly, every other year or so, in a survey course. And more recently, I've asked students literally I've asked that question of the students when they read it before. And what might have been true 20 years ago, when most of them had been exposed to it, it's no longer being read. Or at least not in the students that, this very small sample. I'm not going to make generalizations, but it is certainly not the standard. That may be a good thing, since I feel that whenever I teach the Scarlet Letter, let's say, or Red Bed, or a handful of other books that have been taught in high school, I feel that they're, you have to be of a certain age, I think. You have to have a certain kind of facility with language and with complicated texts that students oftentimes don't quite yet, myself probably included, many decades ago, quite have for a book that's as complicated as this one is. So,
yeah, I think I was also surprised lately how few of them had read it in high school, which didn't bother me, actually. I think it's more appropriate for about an 18-year-old, because that's how old Fleming is. And I'm more and more impressed as I read it. He's just a kid surrounded by a bunch of other kids, and he's confused and he can't figure himself out. And the kids that in your class are in that era. And I think people are too hard on him at the end. I think he becomes an apprentice adult. That's the best you could experience of an 18-year-old. And I think the turning point for him is he begins to forgive himself for abandoning the tattered man. There's nothing he does in battle makes him a man. That does, though, that he comes to grips with himself. So I think 20-year-olds are the proper age to read Red Badge.
Pat, I think that's a very nice observation that you just made. I want to add to it, I think each generation brings its own preoccupation with issues and ideas, and I'm afraid that Crane is not very much at the forefront of what the current generation is worried about. I hate to see that happen to important American writers. One writer I always was interested in was Harold Frederick, for example, and nobody would teach him anymore. Maybe a short story if it showed up. And I think that Crane is fading into the historical woodwork as well. Now, you'd study Crane if you took a course in American realism, really focusing on the late 19th century. Or I used to give a course in the American 1890s, and Crane and Kate Chopin were the two superstars that I would focus on. And that was a very popular course, but I'm not sure students today would sign up for it.
Yeah, I'm also sad to say that it appears that the interest in Crane is waning quickly, and Stephen Crane Studies is all but done now. They've stopped publishing it, which is sad for me.
Yes.
I have an audience question going back to this very basic thing of, this guy who's never been in combat writes about it. It seems immensely plausible. Have you had veterans who have taken your classes, read it, and had distinctive reactions or interesting reactions about its plausibility as an evocation of battlefield psychology?
Well, remember when Hemingway wrote A Farewell to Arms, he had very, very limited war experience. I did a book about that too. He was only 6 days on the front lines, and that was as a canteen worker. When he was an ambulance driver, which was a very brief period, there was no fighting going on in his area of Italy. He mostly carried influenza cases in his ambulance. Then he joined the canteen service and went up to the front lines handing out wine and cheese and that sort of thing. And the 6th day that he was up there, he was hit by a mortar shell and never went back into action. So those 6 days were all that he knew about it. But when he wrote A Farewell to Arms, this is really quite significant for teaching it, I think. He put the action a year before he arrived in Italy. During the time Hemingway was in Italy, things went well for Italy. They won every battle, and his romance went very well, and everything was a big success. He moved it a year earlier with the humiliating retreat from Caporetto, in which Italian soldiers had to shoot their own men coming across the bridge against orders. So Hemingway really did not have personal experience of the kind of fighting that he describes in A Farewell to Arms.
I couldn't comment on veterans' impressions of it, but I was a visiting professor at the Air Force Academy for 3 years, and the cadets were very attuned, very attentive, looking for how things might be when they were in harm's way. There was one cadet who was pre-enlisted, who'd already been in the Air Force and then went back, started college. And he said he didn't like Crane because he's too much in your face. It was too intense. He didn't like it, but I don't know. That's a very good question though, about what veterans would say with their experience in reading Red Badge.
Professor Mitchell?
No, not at all in recent years. That's not. So students, for the most part, are not coming back to class here after having served.
In that case, I'm going to go back. Actually, interpretation was something you brought up. What was the first generation of literary critical response to Red Badge of Courage? And I guess I would actually ask, were they more impressed by his style, his subject matter, or both? And I guess I'm asking this because it's presumably setting the grounds for then the next century plus of literary interpretation. What was the first thing that struck not just the audience, but the people writing the critical essays about it?
I think the European response is important here. The European reviews of the Red Badge of Courage all said essentially that only someone who had personally lived through such experience could possibly write about it in such detail. And of course, Crane wasn't even born until 6 years after the Civil War. So they were quite wrong about that. That's where I think Crane's imaginative approach to describing experience comes into play. He made it believable that a human being was in that situation, experiencing those sights and sounds and feelings, and it's hard not to believe it. It's very intense.
My answer to this would be that, unlike today, the 1890s academic field was looking at people who had already been certified as classic American writers, for whom they mostly thought of people like Cooper or Hawthorne and so on. Not until the post-World War I period where was there more attention being paid to someone like Crane. Mencken, the Baltimore journalist, who also was a literary critic, even claimed that all American literature subsequent to Crane comes from him. It's rather an overstatement, but I don't think much. I'm now really way out on the limb. I'd have to go back and look at what the critical interpretation of Crane was, but I suspect that there wasn't very much heavy critical investigation of Crane until the 1930s and thereafter. I don't know of any. Thomas Beer famously wrote in the 1920s to resurrect his career, but his book seems to have made up a lot of the information that he used, and it's not particularly reliable anymore. But that would be in the 1920s. The kind of close studies that the three of us have done on Crane doesn't come, I think, and anything that stood up has not come until after World War II.
So the interpretive tradition of Crane actually then postdates World War I, and by the time people are starting to seriously analyze him, they already have, say, Hemingway and the other writers about World War I to compare him with.
Something like
Does that,
Yeah.
how did I put it? Has that altered the critical tradition in ways that have closed off possibilities of interpretation in any way?
I'm sure.
I don't think so in this sense that the emphasis would be on the personal experience of war. And that I think would sustain the Red Badge in a way that broader novels like Gone with the Wind or something would not have. As a matter of fact, Gone with the Wind, the war never actually appears. It's all, the focus is the domestic world and soldiers come and go from it. So there is the experience of loss, but not the immediacy of fear and doubt and self-doubt that you would have being out on the battlefield. That's what Crane is so good about. And interestingly, that's what Hemingway emphasizes as well. Heller doesn't really give you that. His approach is so satiric that he makes it humorous. After all, the only the enemy never appears in Catch-22. There's no German soldier in the novel at any point. The only fighting that goes on is when Milo Minderbinder attacks his own unit because he's getting paid by the Germans to do so.
I'm going to go to a question. Can you compare, well, American heroism, versus, international heroism, Greek mythology? In fact, is there a distinctive ideal of American heroism expressed in Crane and perhaps in, comparable American novels writings?
I think there is. I don't think American heroism consists of doing violence to the enemy. I think American heroism is the willing acceptance of vulnerability, putting yourself in harm's way deliberately in order to help someone else. That strikes me as being heroic.
All right, we have consensus on that?
I'm back to my everyday hero. I'm trying to find the quote here. He says that Crane was impressed with Admiral Sampson. He said there was no bunting, no archer, no fireworks, nothing but perfect management of a big fleet. No trumpets, no cheers of populace, just plain unsauced accomplishment. So doing your job is what counts. When I was at the Air Force Academy, I had a long series of conversations with Bill Gibson, who had been in the Vietnam as a Marine and then as an Army captain. We were wondering what was common about the citations of people getting the Congressional Medal of Honor. So we took it upon ourselves to start reading the citations, and there are all kinds of them. And we found out that there were three things in common. The Medal of Honor winners said, first of all, it was nothing special. Secondly, they said, you would have done it too. And the third is, I did it for my comrades. In which there's a very Cranian kind of thing that the people who are closest to the action and are the heroes misunderstand or don't understand the heroic behaviors that they put themselves to. And Crane says much the same about at the end. It's not clear that the participant or the observer is in a better position to explain what.
Sorry, my thing froze for a minute.
I was hung up as well. Yeah.
I lost the sound, yes.
Yeah, sorry. I have another question from the audience, if I may, Richard Morgan, and we'll have two related questions about the point of view. I mean, that he portrays an early postmodern detachment, very recognizable from the novels of the early 20th century. Now, is this actually something you would also agree is distinctive about him or distinctive about the era? And in fact, worth noticing, the point of view, the point of observation.
Well, the observation is so immediate. There are very few broad comments in the Red Badge of Courage, and they're all at the very beginning. Once you get into the second page, it's all focused on Henry's personal experience and how he looks at things. There's no counter point of view that says, well, that's how Henry looked at it, but that isn't the way somebody else looked at it. You're right with Henry Fleming's view of things. He's not always right about things, of course. He misinterprets reality over and over again. For he thinks that he looks out and he sees monsters attacking his men and he turns and runs, and he was totally wrong about that. I don't think there's a countervailing point of view that explains the meaning of things at all. Of course, you're not likely to get that in Crane.
It's one of the things that General McClure, the general who, fired off at Crane's view of, American soldiers as not being heroic enough. What's brilliant about Crane's treatment is that he gives us a view of war that is as old as Achilles and seems as if it could have been written about one of my favorite TV series, Band of Brothers. That is the sense of what it is like, or one could even say Spielberg, who's not my favorite, but Saving Private Ryan. That is that there's something very modern about Crane's treatment, which, as Jim says, is in large part because it isn't flag waving. That is to say, it's not trying to speak up for, we don't even know, as a number of us have said, who are these people? What are they fighting for? That's not the experience that most troops have had in war. And that's what makes his insight into the fears, the aspirations, the immediate feelings as they clash with each other. That's what makes Crane, his insight into all of this, so prescient, but also so far-reaching into the past. Someone has raised a question about the Charterhouse of Parma. Someone else raised it about Norman Mailer's Naked and the Dead. All of these are brilliant treatments, but Crane has his own place that stands, right alongside of theirs, it seems to me.
I don't think in Crane there's ever an authoritarian point of view that say this is reality with a capital T, or truth with a capital T, reality with a capital R. His signature approach is a scattering of episodes. Yeah. And he leaves them for us, the reader, to pull together and make judgments on. There's no overall assessment of any of them that I can see.
I had a number of graduate students who, over the years, who had served in Vietnam. And their general point of view is that the great American war writer is Tim O'Brien. Yeah. And they said, if you read the stories and the things they carried, for example, that's the way it was. And that comes closest from their point of view of capturing the experience that they knew in Vietnam.
Yeah, I've heard the same comment.
So if Henry James had tried to write a war novel, would it be anything like Stephen Crane?
I can only say, as a James scholar and devotee myself, James lived right next to Crane, admired him tremendously. I take it what you're saying is not the man Henry James, but the stylist Henry James, and the figure who's drawing house writings, the British, no, James wasn't drawn to war, but he loved Crane's writing, and I don't happen to know what he thought of Red Bag, but that's the point, that someone can write something completely different about a subject that you're absolutely ignorant about and make it live, and Crane did.
James and Crane actually became quite good friends when Crane was living with Cora in Breed
Right.
Place. And they were frequently together socially and so forth. The writing is quite different, but James actually paid to ship Crane's body back from Germany to New Jersey to be buried. And he also raised some money not only for Cora Crane to take care of Crane's body, but to support Harold Frederick's second wife. Frederick lived in England with two families.
Yeah.
He had a wife and children in London and a wife and children in the suburbs. And when he died, the mistress and her family were totally disinherited. And Henry James raised money to support them. He was quite a remarkable figure in London in the 1890s.
Thank you. That's wonderful. It's a wonderful cameo from his life. I am going to ask, if I may, if the three of you would be so kind as to give closing talks of a minute each, about Crane, anything further you'd want to say, summations, before I then close up the webinar, because we're getting up on our 3:30 deadline. I guess the same order. Professor Dooley, may I ask if you have a minute or something you want to?
When I drove in today, I was wondering what my two panelists, how they got intrigued with Crane. My story was, I went to an NEH seminar, National Endowment for the Humanities seminar in 1978, and I had not read any American literature. Here I'm at the age of 36, and one of the authors we did was Crane, and it was Maggie, and I was just captivated by the style. As Lee was saying earlier, I think what Crane offers is these wonderful doses of style, and you could never guess what he's going to say next, and that's the fun of reading him. And I tend to think of his prize his short stories and his journalism as other examples, other sources for that. So for me, the sustaining thing in Crane is his style more than anything else.
Thank you. Professor Mitchell?
Yeah, the one thing we didn't talk about, and I'm not going to address it now, but is the way in which in Crane, and especially in Red Badge, the indifference of nature, the way in which the sun keeps shining wonderfully on a wonderful afternoon, and that all this mayhem, death, and destruction goes on. I think the thing that I would bring away from this is that Crane is, I think, among the most interesting writers because he focuses on the tyranny of the mind, on the way in which our mental categories dictate our behavior, how our preconceptions actually define us and make us what we are. He delights in showing us how theories and interpretations always misrepresent. They always diminish and limit and alter. And he defies all the explanatory gestures that read out of particulars to claim a larger order. At the end of The Monster, which I encourage people to go read, it's a wonderful, wonderful story. We're left with nothing, no answer, just the judge at the end saying it's hard for a man to know what to do. At the end of The Red Badge of Courage, Henry Fleming has been given a sign. We're told a sign of approval from nature. But the question is it a sign that we can accept? We're left at the end of The Blue Hotel with the Easterner's fog of mysterious theory. Whose fault is it that the Swede dies? He's only an adverb, the Easterner claims. We're left at the end of The Open Boat with, as I said, they felt that they could then be interpreters. It's a wonderful, in almost all of his work, he wants to give us this vivid experience and then put a stop sign in front of it and say, wait, pause before you jump into interpretations that are going to modify that experience. Feel it intensely.
Well,
Thank
I'm
you.
impressed by Lee's comment about the tyranny of the mind. I think that's a good insight into Crane's fiction. I went off to college as a freshman as naive as anyone could be, and what I encountered in the fall of my freshman year was the open boat, which impressed me tremendously. I wanted to go on and read more Crane stories, which I did. But I was impressed that the open boat is not only a story of action, and it's very intense. They're in the boat and the waves are threatening to come over and the shark is circling the boat, and it's very dramatic. But it's also a psychological story as those men come to feel a sense of brotherhood in their mutual struggle to survive in that boat. And it ends with the sense of brotherhood among those men. I think that's a very interesting psychological development in what would otherwise be purely a story of action and survival and struggle against the sea. And that's where it all started for me. And I branched out from that. And well, I can't say I read all of Crane as an undergraduate because it wasn't available at that time. There was no edition of Crane available, but I read the anthologies that existed at the time, one by Stallman, I think.
Let me say one more thing. In the War Memories, Crane begins by saying he's trying to get at the real thing. And to repeat what I said he says at the end, the episode is closed. All you can depend upon is that I told you nothing at all, nothing at all, nothing at all. So figure it out for yourself. That's as far as he's going to take us.
Thank you so much, all. It's been wonderful hearing it. Every one of these webinars is, I must say, for me, an education, and for all our audience, and it's lovely, every one of them. And this is, wonderful, as good as any. And I say that partly to alert people, this is part of a series. The NAS is doing other webinars, both the Great American History webinar and the Great American Novel webinar. They will be showing up in coming weeks. I believe we're doing World War II next week for history, and we're doing the Turn of the Screw on March 8th. I believe that's the next one. So I'm alerting everybody to those. We try to make each one as good as the next. So there's a high standard being set here, but with any luck, the next one will be good too. I want to remind everyone, if you have further questions, please send them to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I will be glad to forward them to the professors, so you will still have a chance to ask more questions. And then to remind everyone that there is a recording of this, ideally up within 24 hours, on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. It will be available for posterity. Having said all that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you very much to our distinguished panelists. Thank you to the audience who came to listen and to provide your questions, which kept all this wonderful Q&A going. So I'm personally delighted, and it's wonderful. And I guess for everybody, just go out and read Red Badge of Courage again, or for the first time. It's clearly worth your while. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.